Hey everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Friday, the 9th. And as you know, you have completed your first speech. Congratulations, the autobiographical 5-minute speech. And now that means that we get to think about speech number 2. And speech number 2 is the informative speech, in which you have 10 minutes, so double the time, in which to teach the audience something. And this time you're going to be asked to use some sort of audio or visual. So I wanted to talk about those pieces. You'll see in the notes below too, I've indicated how I am evaluating your outlines, because in addition to your first speech, you needed to submit in your outline to me to my email. And I'm reviewing the outlines very briefly just to give you ideas of ways that you might be able to improve. But ultimately, the real test of the outline is were you able to deliver a good speech. And the outlines are evaluated informally on a checkmark system. So a plus would be excellent, a check plus would be very good, a check would be satisfactory. There is a less than satisfactory, and there is an unsatisfactory as well. And the idea is that hopefully you will try out different techniques over the course of the semester so that you can find an outline that will be of use to you when you are delivering a speech. And as you know, your outlines aren't necessarily something that you would even be referencing over the course of the speech. If you think about the first speech, you already knew the information. It was about your life. That was done very deliberately. Now, the second speech, you may or may not know all of the information. So it becomes even more important to put down just keywords and phrases, not the entire speech itself, because you don't want to read the speech. You just want some notes to be able to help guide you in the event that you needed some guidance. And again, I kind of liken it to a trapeze artist that has a net just in case they fall, but a good trapeze artist doesn't fall, but a good trapeze artist knows they could fall. Therefore, it's a good idea to have a net. And while there are lots of different ways to do outlines, I've been giving you samples or examples of how to do outlines beneath each of these videos, because what I'm including beneath the videos, the notes for the class, are literally my outline for the actual class itself. So according to my outline, the first thing I needed to talk about was speech number 1, outline, which I've done. And the second section of my outline is about the informative speech. Speech number 2, 10 minutes, where you are using some sort of audio or visual. That will be due on Wednesday, the 14th. So by that point, everyone would have submitted in speech number 1 and viewed the speech of everybody else in the class. That's what we're going to be doing today, but more on that in a little bit. And of course, we would have an opportunity for another quiz, as well as just tying up some odds and ends with the text. But you've probably noticed that we've gone through most of the text already. That was deliberate because I wanted you to be able to have those major pieces before you actually started delivering speeches. And once again, I'll show you some sample speeches next week of students delivering informative speeches. No students in any way connected with GCC, but this will give you some ideas, some models of things that you could consider when you are putting together your own speech. And the informative speech is basically teaching the audience about something. It could be about teaching us about a famous person, or perhaps about a location, a place, perhaps about a thing, perhaps about an event, perhaps about an idea, perhaps a procedure. Perhaps there was something that you discussed in your first speech that you would want to teach us about in your second speech. Not that the first speech or the second, not that the first speech and the second speech need to be connected. They can be entirely different speeches if you so want it. And if you are explaining things, you basically are defining things. If you're demonstrating things, you're basically showing things. And sometimes you do a little bit of both in a speech. A report is when you start to interpret things, that you oftentimes do reports in school and in the workplace. It's one of the ways that school overlaps with some of the expectations of the workplace. But regardless, you want to be clear. You want to be organized. Remember, we have poor memories, and also remember we have poor listening skills. You want to be logical. You want to limit your points because 10 minutes really isn't a lot. And again, there really is only so much information that someone can absorb. You want to use transitions to show when you are moving from one idea to the next. Avoid jargon or specialized language that can only be understood by a small group of people. So, obviously, if you're speaking to a group of healthcare professionals, you would use lots of medical terms. But you aren't speaking to a group of healthcare professionals, even though we may have some healthcare professionals in our class. The assumption is that you're speaking to a general audience, so you should be using language that's appropriate for a general audience. Cluster-like ideas. It was one of the memory techniques that we had talked about, chunking, where you can put like pieces of information into larger groups. It's one of the ways to help you remember information and one of the ways that you can help your audience remember information. Associating new with old, again, another technique that we've talked about in the past for helping with memory. Using repetition, another technique that helps with memory. Addressing different learning styles. People learn differently. Colleges obviously favor oral learning and visual learning as opposed to tactile learning, which is why so much of college is about reading and writing. But of course, the more learning styles that you can address in the time that you have. And even something like this, you can notice that teachers oftentimes will not only say information, but they'll write it out, whether on a whiteboard or perhaps in notes below a video, much like I do. And that's to help with different learning styles that people learn sometimes through reading, sometimes through hearing, sometimes a combination of the two. I've oftentimes suggested if you don't know what your learning style is, think about how you feel most comfortable with directions. Are you comfortable with somebody just telling you directions and then you can get to that location? Then probably one of your primary learning styles is oral. However, if you would prefer to read those directions, then probably one of your learning styles is visual. Now, if you need to actually go to the specific location, and then once you've gone there, then you feel that you can replicate that, then you probably learn through doing, through tactile associations. So, and again, we mix and match all the time, but certainly the more ways that you can present information to an audience, the more likely it is that the audience will understand and remember. So, use effective audio visuals. So remember that the speech is about you. It's not about the audio visual. That should not be supplanting your presentation. So you want to think about balance. In a 10-minute speech, I really wouldn't devote more than a couple of minutes or so to audio and visuals, if that. Obviously, if it were an hour speech, you might want to devote 10 minutes to audio visuals. But you certainly don't want to devote a 10-minute speech to 10 minutes of audio and visual, because that isn't a speech. That's just the audio and visual communicating the information. Sometimes you have to motivate the audience. Sometimes you don't have to motivate the audience. But I can tell you that visual media and audio media can definitely help with understanding, with memory, and also with motivation. And usually when I talk about visual media, people think about something like PowerPoint. Not that I'm in any way averse to PowerPoint. I think it has its time and place. But there are lots of different ways in which you can communicate information visually or through audio. And you can use low tech, or you can use high tech, or you can use some combination thereof. And again, think about some of the unique challenges that you would be facing because you are recording. So for instance, you don't want to necessarily have a PowerPoint that is taking up most of the screen and that your image is just a tiny box in the corner. It should be the other way around. Your face should be the big image on the screen, and the PowerPoint can be a smaller box in the corner. I've seen PowerPoint gone wrong in so many ways where people have made mistakes on the PowerPoint, which become glaring when things are projected. They put too much material on the PowerPoint. You're just supposed to have keywords and phrases. The slides are too busy because there are too many fonts and too many colors, or the sync is off. So PowerPoint is not the be all end all. There are lots of other ways to communicate information. You know, a kind of pre-PowerPoint technique was basically something called a flipboard or a flip chart, where you would have a large pad of paper and you would put it on an easel and you would just basically reveal each sheet of paper at the time that was appropriate. I think of it as a kind of pre-PowerPoint, which is what PowerPoint does. It reveals information at an appropriate time. So sometimes the old ways are best. Charts and graphs work very well, particularly for communicating numerical information so that you can visualize it. Pictures work very well, usually for emotions. And again, you can use a combination of the two. And again, you have to think about how are you going to display a chart or a graph or a picture. Whether you are in a face-to-face situation, you have to think about scale and visibility. But even in something like a recorded presentation, how visible is it? You want to make sure that the lettering isn't backwards when it's being recorded. You know, all of those little elements that go into an effective audio visual. And that said, many times people will use video itself as an audio visual. So again, think about balance. No more than 2 or 3 minutes. You don't want to show a 10-minute, let's say, a clip from a movie for a 10-minute speech. Perhaps a 2-minute clip. And again, if you were in a face-to-face situation, do you have the technology in order to be able to show that? And are you comfortable with using the technology? In a recorded situation, how would you go about doing such a thing so that, again, it's supplementing the speech? It's not replacing your presentation of the speech. And regardless of what you decide to do for an audio or a visual, whether it's something like a whiteboard, which works really nicely actually for jotting down quick ideas, or pictures, which again work nicely to impact emotions, posters, which work really nicely for showing graphs and charts, props, which are actual objects, which can be very useful to get audience engagement. But again, you have to think about the scale of the prop. And is it going to be visible? The same with models. A video or an audio clip, a flip chart or a PowerPoint, even a Zoom screen share. You want to be professional. You want to test your equipment beforehand so that you're comfortable using your equipment. You want to have a backup plan in the event of some sort of technological difficulty. And you want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat, and consider scale, consider proportion. Sure, you can use color, but use color for interest. You don't want to have too many colors because then it becomes too busy. It becomes difficult to follow. You want to be neat and accurate. You want to avoid all capital letters. And certainly you can capitalize a word or even a phrase, but you don't want to put the entire text in all capitals. And I can tell you that I believe just about every English teacher has at least been given one English paper that has been written in all caps. And it is terribly difficult to read. So again, you want to use a combination of the two. What studies have found interesting is that bold is more visible and more memorable than something that's underlined. So if you really wanted something to stand out, bold it rather than underline it. Now, supporting material. You don't need to use any supporting material for this particular speech. Now, that said, it could turn out that you do want to use supporting material for the speech, but you may already know all of the information that you're going to share in your informative speech. You will have to use supporting material in your last speech, in the persuasive speech. But I wanted to talk about supporting material now, just in the event that it turns out that you decide that you do want to use some supporting material for this speech. Supporting material can increase credibility and your persuasiveness. You definitely want to check for accuracy, especially with the internet, especially with artificial intelligence, because there is so much information that is just not valid. The GCC library is a wonderful way to ensure a certain level of validity. It's your tuition dollars at work, so to speak. The GCC library has things like databases. These are electronic resources that wouldn't be available on the open net. That these are sources that basically have been vetted, have been evaluated by humans to ensure a certain level of accuracy and authenticity. And again, that's not to say that everything on a database is foolproof, but it certainly is very useful than going on the wide open internet. I'll never forget where someone had described the difference between going on the internet as opposed to using a database, and they likened it to unsafe and safe sex. And that if you are engaged in unsafe sex, things will probably be okay. But do you want to take the chance? And they liken that to being on the open internet, or what might be applicable for today, artificial intelligence. And safe sex, so to speak, would be using something like an academic library, such as a database, or just even books and magazines that have been reviewed by librarians before they are included in library collections, and that it's much safer. Can something go wrong? Certainly. But again, you do have a certain level of reliability that you wouldn't necessarily have in the open internet. So keep that in mind. This is my plug for using the GCC library. They're databases for a whole host of subjects. Some of them are just general databases. Some are related to specific disciplines. And the good news is that when you're using outside sources, you don't necessarily have to be as detailed as you would be in an academic paper. So you probably are aware, since English 101 or Comp 1 is a prerequisite for this course, that when you are using outside sources and you're quoting, there is a pretty lengthy way of going about documenting those quotes. For English and the humanities, that includes public speaking, we would use the system known as the MLA, or the Modern Language Association, which is a professional organization that's come up with the rules that are appropriate for that particular academic discipline. And the system, the way it works generally when you're writing a paper, is that you use parenthetical documentation. So immediately after a quote, you would open up a parentheses and indicate the least amount of information necessary within that parentheses for the reader to be able to identify where the quote is from. Usually that means something like a page number. And then at the ending of the paper, there's something called a works cited page that lists all of the works, the books, the magazines, the internet sites, and so forth that you've used over the course of the paper that you've cited. And they're all listed in alphabetical order by author's last name. And that's where you give the detailed information of the source, such as the place of publication and the publisher, for instance. So you don't necessarily need to overwhelm an audience in a public speaking situation with all of this detail. Audiences probably don't need to know about the place of publication and the publisher. However, you should be prepared to provide that information in the event that you are asked to do so by an audience member. But what you want to do is focus on using tags. A tag is basically just a kind of heads up, if you will, letting your audience know that the information that you're sharing is not yours. So for instance, starting a statement with something like, according to researchers at Harvard. Now, anything that comes after that obviously is not your original research. And again, I don't necessarily see audience members expecting you to cite things like page numbers afterwards. However, if you are asked, you should be able to give all of the applicable information about the study that was done at Harvard about that particular research. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the third speech. But I wanted, as I said, to talk about it now, just in the event that some of you decide that you might need or want to use an outside resource for your informative speech. Though I usually recommend to students that you choose a topic in your informative speech that you already have some prior knowledge about, especially for a condensed class such as this one. And there's lots of sources that you can use as outside sources. books and magazines and websites are probably the most obvious, but you can use interviews. You can interview somebody who has a certain level of expertise in the subject matter. And of course, you want to go back to ethos and being ethical, that you want to make sure that the person knows they're being interviewed, they give permission to being interviewed, they give permission to your sharing the information from the interview and their identity as well. And if you think about the kinds of information that can persuade an audience, some of them are anecdotes. That's qualitative pieces of information. But some of them are quantitative, and those are facts and statistics. And one is not necessarily better than another. Ideally, you use a combination of the two. So again, thinking about evidence about, let's say, educational effectiveness, then you could look at quantitative information such as, let's say, graduation rates or transfer rates. But qualitative information, stories about people's experiences in education, can be just as valid and just as powerful. And the kinds of accounts that you use, primary accounts are first-hand eyewitness accounts. Secondary accounts are based on primary accounts. And again, one is not necessarily better than another. Both are effective in their own ways. An eyewitness account of somebody who actually experienced something, for instance, a war, obviously you can't negate their personal experiences. But they could be mistaken, they could be lying, they could be misremembering, or they may just have one small piece of a much larger puzzle, which is why quantitative evidence, let's say researchers who've studied that war, can be just as important because they take lots of primary sources and put them together. So using things like examples, statistics, testimony, all of those things can help with strengthening the validity of your arguments, and we'll definitely be doing that with the persuasive speech. But as I said, I wanted to briefly review it now in the event that you wanted to do that for your informative speech. So your attendance question for today is going to be about the speech number 1 that is posted in our class by your classmates. So instead of answering an attendance question on the attendance form, I'm asking you to answer this question and send it to my email. And what I'm going to be doing is gathering all of this information and then summarizing the results and sharing that with you next week. Because what I'm asking you to do is to watch the speech number 1 that's posted from all of your classmates. And you'll see we have a tiny class. And that will be in the same place in which you posted your speech number 1. And then briefly sent to me via email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. One strength and one weakness for each of your peer speeches. And again, what I will do is count that as your attendance. That is going to be due on Sunday the 10th. Again, you've got 48 hours. So for those of you who are thinking about starting this assignment now, do not start this assignment until after midnight of the 8th, because that is the deadline for everyone to post speech number 1. Midnight on the 8th. After midnight on the 8th, it's open game. It's now Friday the 9th. You can watch peer speeches and send strengths and weaknesses to me, and I will compile all of that data and share that with you next week. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week talking about the informative speech. Take care. Bye-bye.